Reid's mornings began with the metallic tang of old coffee and the low, persistent hum of machinery, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards of his small apartment building and into his very bones. His days were spent amidst the rust and dust of the derelict factory, a place where ambition went to die a slow, grinding death. He wasn't a dreamer, not anymore. He was a doer, a fixer, someone who made sure the conveyor belts kept turning, even if they were carrying nothing but the ghosts of forgotten industry. He moved with an efficient, almost brutal determination, his hands calloused from years of wrestling with stubborn gears and corroded wiring. Today was no different. The air in the main assembly hall hung thick with the smell of stale oil and the faint, sweet decay of long-dead rodents. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the endless rows of silent, broken machines. Reid preferred the quiet. It allowed him to think, or, more accurately, to not think, to simply exist within the rhythm of his tasks. He was checking the pressure gauges on an archaic hydraulic press, his brow furrowed in concentration, when the foreman's voice, sharp and unwelcome, cut through the industrial drone. "Reid. Visitor for you. Says it's urgent." Reid straightened slowly, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that was more grease than fabric. A visitor was unheard of. No one came to the factory unless they had a shipment to deliver or a complaint to lodge. He walked towards the office, a cramped, makeshift space walled off with corrugated metal, his boots scuffing on the concrete floor. Standing awkwardly in the doorway was a man in a pinstriped suit, remarkably out of place against the backdrop of peeling paint and exposed conduits. The man held a briefcase clutched tight to his chest, his eyes darting nervously around the cavernous space. "Mr. Reid?" the man asked, his voice thin, almost reedy, struggling to be heard over a distant clang. He merely nodded, his gaze steady, assessing. "What can I do for you?" "My name is Elias," the man began, adjusting his spectacles. "I'm an executor of estates. I'm here regarding the recent passing of a relative of yours, a Mr. Elias Thorne." The name hung in the air, foreign and yet vaguely familiar, like a half-remembered tune. Elias Thorne. Reid hadn't thought of him in years, decades even. A distant great-uncle, perhaps? Someone his grandmother used to mention in hushed tones, always followed by a quick change of subject. He remembered a faint, almost mythical quality to the man, someone who lived far away, deep in the wilderness. "Elias Thorne," he repeated, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, surprise? Curiosity? Stirring within him. "He passed?" Elias nodded gravely. "Quite suddenly, I'm afraid. And, rather unexpectedly, he named you as the sole beneficiary of his estate." Reid felt a strange jolt. Sole beneficiary. The words felt too grand, too important for him, a man whose inheritance usually consisted of nothing more than a new set of worn-out tools. He looked around the derelict factory, the crumbling walls, the silent machines. This was his world. What could Elias Thorne possibly have to leave him? "What estate?" he asked, his voice betraying none of the internal churn. "A property, Mr. Reid. A cabin, deep in the Blackwood Forest. And its contents, of course." Elias paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "It's quite isolated. Ancient, they say. Very old. Isolated. Ancient." The words conjured images not of wealth, but of something else entirely. A prickle of unease started low in his gut. The foreman, who had been listening with an open mouth, cleared his throat loudly. Reid ignored him. He took the thick envelope Elias offered, the paper crisp and official beneath his grease-stained fingers. Inside were documents, maps, and a heavy, tarnished brass key that felt cold against his palm. The address detailed winding, forgotten logging roads that disappeared from most modern maps. It was real. This wasn't some clerical error. The journey began 2 days later, leaving the predictable grime of the factory behind for a landscape that grew progressively wilder. The highway gave way to narrower roads, then to gravel tracks, and finally to a barely discernible path choked with undergrowth. The air changed, growing cooler, thicker with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The forest itself seemed to press in, a dense, watchful presence that swallowed the sunlight whole. He drove his beat-up pickup truck, the engine groaning in protest, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of tires on fallen leaves and the distant caw of a crow. He passed no other vehicles, saw no signs of human habitation for miles. It was as if he was driving to the edge of the world, or perhaps, beyond it. He consulted the hand-drawn map again, the lines faded and indistinct. The cabin was marked with a small, crude X, nestled at the heart of what the map called Thorne's Hollow. The forest grew darker still, the trees towering, their branches interwoven like gnarled, skeletal fingers. Finally, a break in the trees. A clearing, overgrown and choked with weeds, and then, the cabin. It wasn't a rustic retreat, not in the way one might imagine. It was a hunkered-down, ancient thing, built of rough-hewn logs that had long since turned a uniform, weathered gray. Its windows, small and square, were like vacant eyes staring out from under heavy, sagging eaves. A stone chimney, blackened with age, leaned precariously. A shiver, unrelated to the cooling evening air, traced its way down Reid's spine. The cabin didn't feel abandoned, it felt dormant, as if it held its breath, waiting. The air around it was still, unnaturally so, devoid of the usual forest sounds, no chirping insects, no rustling leaves. Only a profound, heavy quiet. He cut the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, a suffocating blanket. He stepped out of the truck, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. The scent of decay was stronger here, not the industrial decay of the factory, but something organic, earthy, and deep. Beneath it, a faint, metallic tang, like old iron or dried blood, just at the edge of perception. He walked towards the cabin, the heavy brass key warm in his hand, a strange mix of determination and apprehension churning within him. He reached the porch, his weight creaking the ancient wood. He slid the key into the lock. It turned with a groan that seemed to echo not just through the cabin, but through the very trees themselves. The cabin closed around him, a silent, waiting presence. The crisp paper of the solicitor's envelope felt cold in Reid's hand, a strange counterpoint to the unexpected heat that bloomed in his chest. Isolated. Ancient. The words echoed, not with promise, but with a faint, almost imperceptible hum of unease. He had a cabin now, a forgotten place deep within a forest he'd never known existed. The solicitor, whose name was Elias, had offered a curt nod, then turned back to his ledger. The foreman, still lingering, had finally retreated, leaving Reid alone with the weight of his new, peculiar inheritance. The drive was long, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to little more than twin ruts carved through an aggressive overgrowth of ferns and wild saplings. The forest pressed in, a dense wall of ancient pines and skeletal birches, their branches interwoven like gnarled fingers. Sunlight, once a bright wash, now filtered down in fractured splinters, creating a perpetual twilight. When the cabin finally emerged, it was less a dwelling and more a silhouette against the fading light. Squat and dark, it seemed to hunch beneath the towering trees, its windows like vacant eyes. A chimney, crumbling at the top, leaned precariously. He sat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, a knot tightening in his stomach. This wasn't the quaint retreat he'd vaguely imagined. This was something else entirely. He spent the first few hours merely surveying the interior. The air inside was still and heavy, carrying the faint, cloying scent of mildew and something drier, like old paper left to rot. Furniture, draped in sagging white sheets, stood like ghostly sentinels. He pulled back a sheet from a sturdy oak table, revealing deep gouges in its surface, as if something sharp had been dragged across it repeatedly. He ran a finger over the scarred wood, a shiver tracing his spine. Old houses had stories, he told himself, but this felt different. As dusk settled, bleeding the last color from the sky, Reid began the arduous task of bringing in his supplies. He stacked boxes of non-perishables in the small, unkempt pantry. He arranged his sleeping bag on a cot he'd unfolded in the main room, opting to forego the musty, sheet-draped bed in the tiny bedroom for now. Fatigue, a dull ache in his bones, warred with a prickling awareness that kept his senses sharp. A floorboard groaned upstairs, a slow, deliberate complaint. Reid paused, his hand hovering over a box of canned goods. Just the house settling, he muttered aloud, the sound of his own voice thin in the vast quiet. A gust of wind rattled a loose pane in the window, and he flinched, his heart giving a small, unwelcome leap. He told himself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliar surroundings. Later, as he tried to start a small fire in the hearth, the chimney drawing poorly, spewing smoke back into the room, he heard it again. Nothing. The next morning, determined to shake off the lingering unease, Reid decided to explore the property, specifically a small, almost illegible notation in the solicitor's packet referring to stored effects at the old factory site. He found the factory about a mile deeper into the woods. A skeletal structure of rusted corrugated iron and shattered windows, half swallowed by kudzu and brambles. This was the derelict factory, a monument to some forgotten industry. Its massive, sagging doors, held shut by a single, corroded padlock, groaned under his touch. He'd brought a heavy-duty bolt cutter, a precaution that now felt disturbingly prescient. Patches of sunlight struggled through gaps in the roof, illuminating swirling dust and the skeletal remains of machinery, twisted and broken like discarded toys. He followed a crude map from the solicitor's packet, guiding him to a section cordoned off by splintered wooden pallets. Behind them, stacked neatly, were several heavy wooden crates, unmarked save for faded, hand-painted initials, E.R., likely his distant relative. As he worked to pry open the first crate, a sharp, metallic clink echoed from the far end of the factory floor, a sound too distinct to be imagination. He froze, hammers suspended. He wasn't alone. The stillness returned, heavier than before. His breath hitched. It had sounded like a tool dropping, or perhaps a small piece of machinery shifting. He waited, muscles tensed, for what felt like an eternity. He dismissed it as a rat, or perhaps the structure itself groaning under its own weight. But the hairs on his arms stood on end. He wrestled open the crate lid. Inside, nestled amongst layers of brittle, yellowed newspaper, were items wrapped in linen. He carefully unwrapped a heavy, tarnished silver locket, its surface intricately engraved with symbols he didn't recognize. Beside it, a small, leather-bound journal, its pages thick and discolored, tied shut with a length of faded crimson ribbon. He picked up the journal, its weight surprising, its cover cool beneath his fingers. He felt a strange compulsion to open it, a sense of urgency. Back at the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into a deep, velvety black. The cabin's windows, now opaque mirrors, reflected only the flickering glow of the small fire he'd managed to coax to life. The noises had returned, soft thuds from upstairs, a scraping sound that might have been a branch against the roof, or something dragging across the floorboards. He'd found a small, ornate wooden carving on the kitchen counter, a grotesque little figure of a creature with too many limbs, its eyes wide and vacant. He was certain he hadn't left it there. He remembered seeing it on a shelf in the bedroom earlier, half hidden behind a stack of books. He'd moved it, hadn't he, or had he? The uncertainty was a tiny splinter, lodged deep. He sat by the fire, the journal resting in his lap, its crimson ribbon untied. The scent of old paper and something else, something faintly earthy, emanated from it. He opened the cover. The handwriting was spidery, almost illegible in places, penned in faded brown ink. The first few pages were mundane, entries about weather and planting. Then, abruptly, the tone shifted. It watches. It waits. The pact. It demands its due. Reid's breath caught. He stared at the words, his mind struggling to reconcile them with the mundane reality he'd tried to impose on this place. A seed of doubt, once merely a prickle, now began to unfurl its tendrils, rooting itself firmly in his gut. The cabin wasn't just old. It was aware. And it was waiting for him. Reid's breath caught, snagged in his throat like a burr. A chill, deeper and more profound than any near draft, snaked through him. The small disturbances, the fleeting shadows, the misplaced carving, they weren't just tricks of the light or the settling of an old house. They were deliberate. A message. The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with something unseen, something pressing in. A low, guttural groan vibrated through the floorboards, not the groan of old timber, but something deeper, more resonant, like a vast, ancient creature stirring beneath the earth. A single, heavy iron pot hanging from a hook above the hearth began to swing, slowly at first, then gaining momentum, scraping against the stone with a metallic shriek that set Reid's teeth on edge. He watched, frozen, as the pot swung wider, faster, until it crashed against the stone with a deafening clang, sending a shower of sparks into the dying embers. He flinched, a ragged gasp escaping him. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't his imagination. Something was here. Something was actively asserting its presence. The rational part of his brain, the part that dealt with spreadsheets and deadlines, tried to construct an explanation, a loose beam, a tremor, a perfectly timed gust of wind. He wasn't just uneasy anymore, he was afraid. He was no longer a curious heir, he was a trespasser. He needed answers, not just theories. The internet, his usual first port of call, proved frustratingly sparse. Generic historical records of the region offered nothing beyond logging operations and settler movements. The local library, a small, dusty building a half-hour drive away, yielded equally little on the cabin itself, only vague references to old families and the unsettled lands to the west. It was in a brittle, yellow town gazette from the early 1900s, tucked away in a forgotten archive box, that he found a cryptic mention of a peculiar land dispute involving his distant relative, the former owner. A site of ancestral significance. The Gazette hinted at a lengthy, unresolved conflict and a subsequent, almost immediate abandonment of the specific plot of land. The article then referenced a defunct local records office, now a forgotten corner of the old industrial district, within what was once a bustling manufacturing hub. It described the building as a repository for all things deemed too obscure for modern preservation. The lead was tenuous, a thread barely visible, but Reid clung to it. He drove through the winding forest roads, the canopy dense and suffocating even in the afternoon light, until the trees gave way to a landscape of skeletal structures and crumbling brickwork. He found the address, a vast, imposing structure of blackened brick and shattered windows, a derelict factory. Rust-stained walls wept streaks of orange down to the cracked asphalt. Weeds burst through every crevice, claiming the ground back with tenacious green. The wind, which had been a gentle murmur in the forest, here whistled through unseen gaps, creating mournful, reedy complaints. He stepped inside. The factory floor stretched out, an expanse of pitted concrete littered with the husks of machinery, their gears locked in silent rigor mortis, draped in cobwebs like ancient shrouds. Every step he took echoed, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings and vast, empty spaces, making him feel utterly alone and exposed. He navigated a maze of rusted presses and skeletal conveyor belts, following a faint, hand-painted sign that read Records, Lower Level. The sign was barely legible, faded by time and neglect. Inside, crammed into metal filing cabinets that groaned under the weight of decades of neglect, were stacks of brittle paper, ledgers, and maps. His fingers, trembling slightly, sifted through the dusty documents. Most were mundane, detailing land surveys, property taxes, defunct business permits. Then, in a ledger marked Unresolved Disputes 1920 to 1940, he found it. A series of entries, all concerning the parcel of land where his cabin now stood. Not just a dispute, but a record of a legal battle over ancestral rights and ancient rights. The entries mentioned a local family, not his own by name, but one tied to the indigenous population, claiming the land was sacred, a burial ground. It read, "The pact was made. The blood debt will be paid." Reid stared at the words, his breath catching once more. Pact. The small disturbances, the carving, the groaning earth beneath the cabin, they weren't just random phenomena. They were consequences. The cabin wasn't just built on an ancient burial ground, it was built on a broken promise, a debt coming due. Reid's gaze clung to the carved words, pact. Blood debt. They were rough, gouged deep into the aged wood of the desk, stark against the faded grain. A chill, colder than any draft, seeped into his bones, settling there like an unwelcome guest. The small disturbances, the unsettling whispers, the groaning earth beneath the cabin, they weren't random. They were threads in a tapestry he was only just beginning to unravel, a tapestry woven with something ancient and hungry. He ran a trembling finger over the letters, the wood rough beneath his touch. This wasn't a warning, it was a statement. A declaration. The cabin wasn't just old, it was a vessel, a monument to a forgotten bargain. He remembered the faint, almost imperceptible tremor that sometimes ran through the floorboards, a low hum that vibrated up through his feet. It wasn't just the house settling, it was the land itself, restless and demanding. The fragmented journal entries he'd found earlier flashed through his mind, cryptic references to the binding and the offering. He had dismissed them as the ramblings of a troubled mind, but now, with these words before him, a terrifying clarity began to emerge. He needed more. His eyes scanned the desk, then the surrounding room, searching for any other clue. A derelict factory, its brickwork crumbling, its windows like vacant eyes. Could it be? A desperate resolve hardened in him. He wouldn't sit here, waiting for the cabin to reveal its secrets at its own pace. He would hunt them down. The drive to the derelict factory was a blur of gravel roads and dense, encroaching forest. The sky, once a pale gray, now bruised purple, threatening rain. The factory itself rose from the overgrown landscape like a tombstone for ambition, a vast, skeletal hulk of rusted corrugated iron and broken glass. Reid parked the truck a good distance away, the crunch of tires on loose stones echoing too loudly in the preternatural quiet. The only sound was the wind, a low moan through the empty window frames, like the factory itself was sighing. The main gate hung askew on one hinge, a gaping maw. Each of Reid's footsteps echoed, magnified, making him acutely aware of the vast, empty space around him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he were walking into the belly of some colossal, slumbering beast. He moved deeper into the factory, guided by an instinct he couldn't name. He passed enormous, rusted vats, their surfaces flaking like diseased skin, and conveyor belts draped with decades of cobwebs. He called out, his voice swallowed instantly by the cavernous space. No answer. Then he saw it. It looked out of place amidst the industrial decay, too domestic, too deliberate. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat. The crate was heavy, sealed with thick, rusty nails. He pried it open with a loose piece of rebar he found nearby, the wood groaning in protest. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. It was thick, its pages yellowed and brittle, but intact. Reid pulled the journal out, his fingers trembling. The leather was cool beneath his touch, surprisingly smooth. He flipped it open to the first page, his breath catching in his throat. The handwriting was neat, precise, unlike the frantic scrawls he'd found in the cabin. This was a complete record. The journal belonged to a distant ancestor, a man named Elias. Elias detailed the founding of the cabin, not as a home, but as a warden's post. He spoke of the land, ancient and hungry, steeped in a primal power that demanded appeasement. He wrote of a pact, made generations before him, a desperate bargain to quell a malevolent presence that threatened to consume everything. The entity is bound to this earth, Elias had written, his script growing tighter, more urgent. It draws its strength from the very soil, from the roots that pierce the ground. Our family, the wardens, are its tether, its keepers. We are bound by blood to maintain the balance, to offer what is due, lest it break free and devour all. Reid's eyes darted down the page, his mind reeling. The blood debt, he read, is not paid in coin, but in life. One must be offered when the entity stirs, when the veil thins, when the land demands its due. A life to sate its hunger, to renew the pact, to buy another generation of peace. His vision blurred. The words swam before him, each one a hammer blow to his psyche. His ancestor hadn't just built a cabin, he had built a cage, and his family were the unwilling jailers. The entity wasn't just haunting the cabin, it was the land itself, an ancient, insatiable hunger that his lineage was cursed to feed. The sudden, mysterious death of his distant relative, the one who'd left him the cabin, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was the payment. And now, the cabin, the land, was stirring again. He was the new warden. He was the next offering. A low groan, not from the factory, but from the very ground beneath his feet, vibrated up through the concrete. The sound was deep, resonant, a hungry growl that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. And he was next in line. The words still vibrated behind Reid's eyes, a discordant hum against the bone of his skull. Jailers. The cabin wasn't just a place of dread, it was a prison, built by his own bloodline, to contain an ancient hunger that now turned its gaze upon him. He stood in the main room, the journal clutched in a hand that trembled, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He couldn't stay here, not with the walls breathing his ancestors' confession. His gaze fell upon an old, faded map tucked into the back of the journal. It wasn't a topographical chart, but a crude sketch, marked with a peculiar, almost arcane symbol. The symbol recurred in the journal's margins, always near mentions of the binding and the place of iron. A single, smudged X marked a location deep within the forgotten woods, far from any established path, labeled simply, the forge. Reid drove, the engine a reassuring growl against the rising clamor in his mind. The forest canopy was a suffocating tunnel, branches clawing at the sky, obscuring the sun. He followed the map, pushing through overgrown tracks until the trees finally receded, revealing a desolate landscape. Rust-colored structures clawed at the gray sky, a sprawling, skeletal ruin. A sign, barely legible, hung askew, Blackwood Foundry, Est. 1888, it was the derelict factory. He parked the vehicle some distance away, the gravel crunching under his boots as he approached the main gate, which hung open, a gaping maw of twisted metal. The air here was different, not the damp, earthy scent of the forest, but a sharp, metallic tang, mingled with the acrid ghost of burnt chemicals and decay. The wind whistled through broken windows, an eerie, mournful sound that seemed to carry whispers just beyond the range of comprehension. Inside, the vast space was a cathedral of ruin. Light filtered through shattered skylights, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air like phantom embers. Massive machinery, rusted and silent, loomed like petrified beasts. Reid's footsteps echoed, each sound magnified, swallowed, then returned to him distorted. He moved deeper, his eyes scanning for anything that might relate to the journal, to the pact. His ancestors' obsession had led him here, to this place of industry and forgotten toil. A low thrum began, not in the air, but in his chest, a vibration that grew with each step. He passed a row of enormous, corroded vats, their surfaces pitted and flaking. Jailer. The blood. The hunger. It wasn't just a memory, it was a direct address. He found it in a small, enclosed office, remarkably preserved amidst the decay. A heavy, iron-bound ledger lay open on a desk buried under decades of dust. With a shudder, Reid wiped away the grime. Not just a pact, but a sustained, generations-long practice of feeding the entity. The factory wasn't just a forge, it was a charnel house, a place where the pact was enforced. His ancestors hadn't just built a cage, they had actively provisioned it. As he read the last entry, dated just a few years prior, a new, more profound thrumming began. The entire derelict factory seemed to vibrate around him. A distant clank, like heavy chains dragging, reverberated from the deeper recesses of the building. Suddenly, a massive metal door at the far end of the factory floor, previously sealed shut, groaned open an inch, then another, with a sound like tearing flesh. He stumbled back, knocking over a stack of rusted files. Reid. The lineage. It waits. You are next. He saw flashes, distorted faces, skeletal hands reaching, the cabin's windows glowing with an internal, malevolent light. His perception warped. The silent machinery seemed to shift, its rusted gears grinding without power, its metal arms extending, reaching for him. The vast space of the factory began to contract, the walls closing in, the ceiling lowering, pressing down. He clawed his way out of the office, gasping for breath, but the pressure followed. It was tied to his blood, to the land, and to him. The derelict factory was just another extension of its reach, another part of the cage. He was not just an heir, he was the next sacrifice in line. He would break the pact, or he would become another name in the ledger. Reid stood amidst the rusted hulks of machinery, the final entry clutched in his trembling hand. The factory wasn't just a site of industry, it was a mechanism, a ritual ground. This wasn't just a place, it was a hungry maw. He had to leave. Not just the factory, not just the cabin, but this entire cursed forest. He needed to get out, to find someone, anyone, who could understand, who could help. The thought of a telephone, of a human voice on the other end, was a desperate beacon in the suffocating gloom. Reid stumbled back through the factory's vast, echoing shell. He imagined the unseen eyes that must have watched his ancestors perform their grim duties here, and now watched him, a new link in a very old chain. His battered truck was parked near the cabin, a forgotten island in the encroaching wilderness. He pushed through the dense undergrowth, the branches clawing at his jacket, the mud sucking at his boots. The forest felt different now, no longer merely ancient but actively hostile. The trees seemed to lean in, their gnarled limbs like skeletal fingers, their leaves whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. Reaching the cabin, Reid fumbled for his keys, his hands clumsy with urgency. He snatched his phone from the counter. No signal. He jabbed at the screen, frustration mounting. He tried again, moving to the window, then the doorway, then even stepping back outside onto the porch. Nothing. Just a blank bar and the infuriating no service notification. It was impossible. He'd had intermittent service before, enough to check messages, to send the occasional text. He wasn't just in a remote location, he was cut off. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, or the factory, or the burial ground. It was in the very air, in the silent network that connected him to the outside world. He could outrun whatever this was. He grabbed his truck keys, a desperate resolve hardening his jaw. He would leave everything behind, the cabin, the factory, the ancestral burden. He would drive until the trees thinned, until he saw asphalt and streetlights, until he felt the reassuring hum of civilization. The forest road, usually a rutted track, seemed to have shifted. What had been a straight shot to the main road now twisted and turned with unnatural bends. The canopy overhead was so thick it swallowed the already fading afternoon light, plunging the path into a premature twilight. Reid gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The truck's engine coughed to life, a rough, sputtering sound that did little to reassure him. He shoved it into gear, dust billowing behind him. Minutes turned into an eternity. He passed the same gnarled oak 3 times, its distinctive split trunk a mocking landmark. The further he drove, the deeper he seemed to sink into the forest's embrace. The engine began to sputter more violently, the dashboard lights flickering like dying embers. A low growl emanated from beneath the hood, a sound that had nothing to do with mechanics and everything to do with a living, predatory hunger. Then, with a final, wheezing gasp, the engine died. Silence descended, profound and absolute, broken only by the frantic thrum of his own pulse against his eardrums. Reid tried the ignition again. The starter motor whined weakly, then clicked. He tried once more, and again. Dead. Utterly, irrevocably dead. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, a guttural cry escaping his throat. He leaned back, pressing his head against the headrest, closing his eyes. The forest pressed in, an immense, unseen presence. He could feel it, a vast, ancient consciousness that permeated every leaf, every root, every stone. It wasn't just the entity in the cabin, it was the entire landscape, alive and malevolent, responding to its master. He opened his eyes. The windshield was coated in a fine layer of condensation, blurring the already indistinct shapes of the trees. But it wasn't just condensation. He reached out, his finger tracing a path through the grime. It smelled faintly of decay, but also something sweet, cloying, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. He saw movement then, at the very edge of his vision, deep within the tangled undergrowth. Not a deer, not a squirrel. Something too tall, too gaunt, too still. Reid's breath hitched. He wasn't just lost, he was hunted. The entity wasn't confined to a single location, nor was it passive. It was active, pervasive, and it was drawing him deeper into its domain. His escape had been a cruel illusion, another turn of the screw. He wasn't leaving, he was being herded. He was trapped, and the forest, with its ancient, malevolent will, was merely a vast, living extension of his captor. His sanity, a fragile thing to begin with, now felt like a thread fraying under an unbearable strain, threatening to snap at any moment. Each shuddering breath was a struggle against the invisible weight that had settled over him. He looked around the cavernous space, the skeletal remains of conveyor belts and presses looming like petrified beasts in the dim, grimy light filtering through high, cracked windows. His gaze fell upon a section of the factory floor he hadn't fully explored, a corner where the machinery was denser, older, almost fused with the earth itself. There, partially obscured by a fallen support beam and a cascade of rusted pipes, was a section of floor that wasn't concrete. It looked less like part of the factory and more like something the factory had been built around, an ancient scar on the land. He stumbled over debris, his boots crunching on shards of glass and dried leaves, his eyes fixed on the strange stone. As he drew closer, the cloying sweetness in the air intensified, now laced with something else, a faint, coppery tang that prickled the back of his throat. He reached the edge of the stone, kneeling, his hand hovering inches above its surface. It was covered in faint, swirling patterns, not carvings but natural veins, like the grain of some monstrous, petrified wood. And then he saw it, a small, almost imperceptible depression at the center, a shallow basin that seemed to pulse with that same faint, unearthly light. As his fingers brushed the edge of the basin, a shudder ripped through the factory. It wasn't a structural groan or the shifting of settling metal. It was a deeper tremor, a resonance that vibrated through the very ground beneath him, through the rusted floor plates and up into his teeth. The faint light from the basin intensified, blooming into a sickly, emerald glow. Then, it was no longer just a glow. From the center of the stone, a form began to coalesce, indistinct at first, like smoke rising from unseen embers. It had no discernible features, no eyes or mouth, yet Reid felt its ancient awareness fix upon him, a gaze that burrowed directly into the deepest chambers of his mind. He clutched his head, collapsing onto the grimy floor, the rusted metal biting into his knees. Images, raw and brutal, flooded his consciousness, an onslaught of sensation and memory that wasn't his own. He saw the first ancestor, a desperate bargain struck in the twilight of human memory, on this very ground, a pact with something that predated trees and rivers, a primeval force of consumption tied to the very earth. The entity had always been here, not a ghost, but a foundational hunger, a primordial warden of the land, awakened and then placated by a binding agreement. His ancestors, in their ambition and fear, had offered it a perpetual tithe, a life from their lineage, chosen at its prime, to sustain its ancient power and ensure the family's prosperity. The factory was merely the latest iteration of the ritual ground, its mechanisms a modern facade for an ancient, barbaric practice. The machinery didn't just process resources, it harvested energy, fear, and, ultimately, life. It wasn't about appeasement, it was about payment. The entity wasn't evil in a human sense, it was a force of nature, a pact-bound devourer. It demanded its due. The shriek intensified, 1,000 voices screaming his name, calling him, pulling him. The emerald light pulsed, drawing him closer. The sacrifice was not merely a life, it was the essence of that life, the vitality, the fear, the potential. And now, the pact demanded its next payment. The lineage had been thinned. The time was upon him. Reid understood with a clarity that threatened to shatter his sanity. The entity's true nature was hunger, its origin ancient beyond human comprehension, and its demand was his own life, a final, horrifying consummation to perpetuate the cycle. He was the next offering. The chill of the derelict factory clawed at Reid's skin, but it was the cold dread in his gut that truly bit. He stared at the final, desperate scrawl in the old ledger, a lineage of sacrifice, a horror fed. He wasn't just inheriting a cabin, he was inheriting a debt, a sentence. He tucked the ledger into his pack, his fingers clumsy with a sudden, profound weariness. A low groan echoed from deeper within the structure, the sound of rusted girders shifting, or perhaps, the building itself sighing under the weight of its grim history. There was no escape, only confrontation. He was the last link in the chain, and if he didn't sever it, the horror would simply continue, perhaps finding new, unsuspecting kin to claim. The journey through the forgotten forest felt different this time, heavier. The familiar whisper of wind through the pines now sounded like a collective sigh, a mournful chorus anticipating his return. He felt eyes on him, not just the fleeting sense of being watched, but a pervasive, physical pressure, as if the very air had solidified into an unseen presence trailing his steps. When the cabin finally emerged from the deepening twilight, it was a grotesque silhouette against the bruised sky. A low hum vibrated through the ground beneath his feet, a sound that wasn't heard so much as felt, a deep thrumming that resonated in his bones. Reid pushed the door open the rest of the way, stepping into the suffocating interior. The hum intensified, vibrating the very floorboards. He fumbled for his flashlight, its beam a meager defiance against the profound gloom. The walls seemed to breathe, the ancient timber warping and shifting as if alive. He felt a crushing weight descend, a palpable pressure that made his ears pop and his chest ache. This wasn't just a house, it was the entity's lair, its true form, its very being. He saw glimpses of a life he could have had, a life free of this generational curse, dangled just out of reach. Growing heavy and viscous. He took the silver knife, its blade reflecting the faint, internal glow of the entity. The true horror wasn't just the sacrifice, but the insidious way it had woven itself into the fabric of his family, waiting for the last thread to snap. The entity wasn't just consuming a life, it was consuming the line. It is not broken by ritual, but by absorption. The bloodline is the vessel, its end is the beginning of true hunger. His ancestors hadn't been trying to break the pact, they had been trying to delay its ultimate fulfillment, passing the burden down, hoping someone else would face the final claim. He was the end of that line, and the entity sought not just his death, but his very essence, to be woven into its eternal, malevolent being. To break the pact meant to deny it its ultimate prize, to sever the connection entirely, even if it meant. He raised the knife, its silver edge glinting in the unnatural light. He felt his will fraying, his sanity teetering on the brink, but a desperate, furious resolve surged through him. He wouldn't just be consumed, he would fight. He would deny it. He would be the last. The cabin groaned, a sound like tortured wood in dying breath, as the entity shrieked, a sound that ripped through the very fabric of the air, promising oblivion, promising eternal torment. His skull throbbed with a dull, insistent rhythm, a drumbeat against the inside of his temples. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, every joint a grinding hinge. The air was cold, thick with the scent of mildew and decaying industry, not the familiar, earthy dampness of the cabin. His eyes, crusted and heavy, finally managed to focus. He wasn't in the cabin. The rough, splintered floor beneath him was concrete, dusted with grime. Above, a skeletal framework of rusted girders stretched into the gloom, supporting a roof that wept slow, black tears of water and decay. The vast, echoing space around him was a derelict factory. Broken windows, like vacant eyes, stared out into a gray, indifferent sky. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he coughed, a dry, rattling sound that scraped his throat. His hands, when he finally brought them into view, were raw and bleeding, the skin torn in places, smeared with what he now recognized as his own dried blood. He felt as if a vital organ had been scooped from his chest, leaving only a vast, aching emptiness. He tried to recall the final moments in the cabin, the crescendo of ancient voices, the pulsing hearth, the overwhelming sense of condemnation. It was a fragmented nightmare, a series of searing images and deafening sounds that refused to coalesce into a coherent memory. He remembered a searing pain, a desperate, guttural cry that might have been his own, and then nothing. Rusting machinery, hulking and silent, lay half-buried in drifts of dust and debris. He moved slowly, each step a deliberate effort, his body a leaden weight. He felt for his phone, his wallet, gone. Everything gone. A profound sense of loss settled over him, heavier than the physical pain. It wasn't just the objects, it was a deeper severance, a feeling that a piece of him had been excised. He touched his chest, his throat. No visible wounds apart from the scrapes, but the internal ache was profound. He felt diminished. As if the entity, in its retreat, had taken a toll, a tithe of his very essence. His memories of the relative, the one whose death had started all this, were strangely muted, as if seen through a thick pane of distorted glass. The warmth, the brief flicker of connection he'd felt, was gone, replaced by a dull, academic understanding. That, he realized with a jolt of fresh horror, was the cost. It had taken his capacity for certain emotions, perhaps, or specific memories that might have aided him. The cabin, he thought, Was it truly quiet now? Driven by an instinct he couldn't name, he began to explore the derelict factory. The scale of the place was immense, a labyrinth of decaying metal and crumbling brick. He moved past rows of defunct presses, their gears locked in eternal stillness, past workbenches littered with fossilized tools. His breath hitched. This wasn't just a random find. This felt deliberate. With trembling hands, he pried open the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, brittle leaves, lay a collection of items. A tarnished silver locket, its chain broken, held a faded, unidentifiable photograph. A small, intricately carved bird figurine, its wings snapped. And beneath them, a sheaf of yellowed parchment, brittle to the touch. He carefully lifted the parchment. And there, etched into the bottom of the final page, was a crude drawing, a stylized depiction of the cabin, and next to it, the unmistakable outline of this very factory. The reveal hit him like a physical blow. The factory wasn't just a random place of refuge or awakening. It was connected. Intimately. This was where the pact had been documented, perhaps even where the sacrifices had been prepared. The locket, the figurine, they were not just trinkets. They were tokens, remnants of lives, of other costs. Each object a silent testament to a life consumed, a spirit diminished. The horror hadn't just been confined to the cabin, it had spread, seeped into the very ground, leaving its mark on other places, other lives. The entity wasn't just bound to the cabin. It had tentacles, reaching out, touching generations, claiming its due. He had survived, yes, but the cost was profound, etched into his very being. He pushed himself up, his muscles screamed in protest, each fiber a taut wire humming with exhaustion. Above him, a skeletal lattice of iron girders crisscrossed a vaulted ceiling, broken in places to reveal slivers of a bruised, twilight sky. He was not in the cabin. He was in the derelict factory. The vast space stretched around him, a cathedral of decay. Broken machinery, hulking and silent, stood like petrified beasts. Rust swept down concrete pillars, painting them in streaks of ochre and umber. A chill permeated the air, a damp, penetrating cold that settled deep in his bones, colder than the fading light filtering through grimy windows. He remembered. Not everything, not clearly. But fragments, like shards of obsidian, cut through the fog. The chanting, the oppressive weight in the air, the way the shadows had coalesced, not just around him, but within him. He had faced it. The entity. The pact. He had offered something. Not his life, not directly. But a piece of himself, a fundamental component of his perception of reality. He had spoken back. He glanced at them. His own, he surmised, from a gash on his forehead that now pulsed with a dull ache. He had been bleeding out his fear, his sanity, perhaps. But the thing asterisk was gone. Or, at least, it was no longer tethered to the cabin, no longer actively reaching for him. He had severed the immediate connection, but the cost. The cost was a gaping maw in his soul. He staggered to his feet, each movement in agony. His knees threatened to buckle, but he forced them to hold. He had to leave. He stumbled towards a gaping hole in the factory wall, a section where bricks had crumbled away entirely. Outside, the forest was a deeper, more ominous silhouette against the dying light. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of strained muscles and heightened senses. Every snapping twig, every hoot of an owl, every rustle of unseen creatures sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The world was louder, sharper, more defined, yet simultaneously more alien. The forest, once merely secluded, now throbbed with an unseen life, a vast, indifferent consciousness that had witnessed countless generations of the pact. He was merely another thread in its ancient tapestry. When he finally reached the cabin, its silhouette against the bruised sky seemed less menacing, more empty. He entered the cabin. Just dust motes dancing in the last rays of sun, illuminating a profound emptiness. The air was stale, but clean of the malevolent tang that had permeated it for weeks. He walked through the rooms, touching the rough-hewn walls, the cool surface of the ancient fireplace. It was done. The entity was no longer here. He had broken the immediate cycle. His eyes were deeper, ringed with a perpetual weariness that felt as old as the cabin itself. His jaw was set, a grim determination etched into the lines around his mouth. He was no longer just Reid, the man who had inherited a cabin. He was Reid, the man who had faced a timeless horror and, in doing so, had become something else. He packed a single bag, not bothering with sentimentality. Clothes, a few essentials. He left everything else behind, the books, the artifacts, the remnants of a life he could no longer truly inhabit. As he walked away, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling his nostrils, he didn't look back. He had escaped, yes. He had survived. The world hadn't ended, but his place in it had been irrevocably warped.